Good evening, everyone. My name is Premanka Goswami, and I'm a senior commissioning editor at Penguin Random House. And on behalf of Penguin, I welcome you to the launch of the book Staggering Forward Narendra Modi and India's Global Ambition by Bharat Karnad. The book examines Prime Minister Modi's military as well as foreign policies in the context of India's evolving socio-political and economic milieu to understand why India has or has not progressed much towards becoming a consequential power. And we have a brilliant pool of panelists to thrash this out. Yashwant Sinha, former Union Minister of External Affairs, Admiral Arun Prakash, former Chief of the Naval Staff of India, Jairam Ramesh, member of Rajya Sabha, former Union Minister and an eminent biographer, Shiv Shankar Menon, India's former National Security Advisor, will be in conversation with Bharat Karnad. Bharat is a professor at Center for Policy Research, is a national security expert. Today's evening will be moderated by Ajay Shukla. Ajay is a business standard columnist on strategic affairs, defense, and diplomacy, is a retired colonel of Indian Army. May I invite all our panelists to come to the stage, please? And I would request Ajay to take the evening forward. Thank you very much.
The package you're releasing.
We're waiting for Bharat. I'll just find him out.
Thanks for. He's already. Thank you very much for joining us for the release of Bharat's book. Everybody is familiar with Bharat. Everybody is familiar with all the panelists. So I won't waste any time introducing people here. We'll start with a brief overview of the book by Bharat and then move straight into the discussion of some interesting aspects of the book featuring the eminent panelists. So over to you, Bharat.
Sure, thanks. This is a very brief sort of outline of the book. I shan't be getting into the details because there's no time. I think we had very high hopes when Mr. Narendra Modi was elected and came to power with the current majority and so on. And by and large, he has failed to deliver, except perhaps in terms of rhetoric and in terms of imagery of success. I mean, he's very good at it. He's been able to telegraph a level of success that really isn't there. And one of the reasons, I think, is that he has, even though he promised a certain radical makeover of the Indian government, and that's what many of us had hoped. I'm an Edmund Burkean conservative myself, and I'd hoped that the government would get out of the business of being intrusive. But as Burke warned, a large government is inherently tyrannical. The thing that Mr. Modi brings to mind is that he is one of the many strongmen, alpha males who are now taken over in many countries. And there is in the first two chapters a comparative analysis of these alpha male leaders. Among them, besides Modi, of course, Donald Trump, Erdogan in Turkey, Shinzo Abe in Japan, Vladimir Putin, of course, and Xi Jinping in China. There, in some ways, many similarities in the way they work, in the manner they have mobilize their societies, and essentially in the way they have polarized their polities to benefit themselves, each of them. And surprisingly, even Putin has used religion. Religion is actually a common kind of a string that you see these alpha male leaders exploiting to their advantage, their domestic advantage. Putin, because we think of him as a successor to the Soviet state, as a member of the 5th Directorate that he was counterintelligence 2nd Directorate KGB, but as member of the 5th Directorate, he dealt with the internal religious, whatever residual elements there were of the Russian Orthodox Church. And that's when he developed these links with the church. When he became, when he was elected president the first time, he reforged those links, gave back to the Russian Orthodox Church its vast land holdings and wealth. And so he now has a church behind him. And he's using the church against the secular, curiously and ironically, the secular parts of the society that are kind of left over from the Soviet days. So this is the kind of pattern you see with all these alpha male strongmen leaders. Mr. Modi, for his part, is not a very complex person. And in a chapter I've sort of looked at I've sort of tried to psychologically profile him using the literature of leadership and psychology and so on. And you find amongst the phenotypes that he's active, aggressive, that he's a narcissist, that he's authoritarian, things that we all can obviously surmise from his actions and the way he conducts himself in public. Much of this, curiously, he has, you didn't have to delve much into to pry out these secrets. He has made this known to his biographers, a whole bunch of them, and has revealed himself. Unfortunately, not many people have read these biographies, but they give an insight into the man. And what you find is, for instance, why is he so hierarchical? Well, because he served in the RSS, which is an extremely hierarchical organization. He has talked of the RSS as virtually a business school that has taught him business practices as to how to run an organization. In this case, the Government of India is merely a larger organization. And the sort of person he is, and the way he was acculturated in the RSS and grew up and had his norms and values shaped by the RSS, you have a very keen idea of the man and the leader that he has become. For instance, you talk with narcissism. Most major countries dealing with him have actually played on his vanity. An insider of Obama, has publicly said that we exploited the fact that Mr. Modi was vain. And he has said this. So if you go back to what Obama, all the backslapping and hugging and embracing, you'll discover an awful lot of this his being played by the US State Department and these people who have actually worked on profiling him and gaining insights into the man. As to his method of governance, very simply, again, RSS, his notion of reaching the top is that everybody defers to him. That's how we saw the Sarsang Chalak and the other office holders in the RSS behave. He saw that they were deferred to by the lower orders, always and every time. They were never questioned. There was no criticism. What they said went. He's used to it. That's why you now have a system of government where he's the sole fount of policy ideas. Now, how does he get his policy ideas from? By and large, well, let's just say his education has been spotty in a formal sense. But he's obviously quick on the uptake and has a phenomenal memory, which is true. And he, of course, harks to these traits of his, to his biographers, and says and tells them that I don't rely on anybody. Nobody influences my thinking. Thoughts come to me. It's a God-given gift. I'm using his phrase, incidentally. He says God-given gift. And he says that essentially, and this is my surmise, that he thinks that he's his own best think tank. In other words, he doesn't need anybody to help him out in terms of the substance or shape of policy, or even the direction of policy, both foreign and military, which is what this book deals with, because that's my field. Economic and other areas are not. But two other things, and very quickly, and I'll end. Some of the programs, social programs, for instance, you can straight away draw a straight line from his younger experiences of his mother, for instance, slaving over a stove, burning dung fuel, and so on. And you connect that to the Ujjwala program of getting gas cylinders to the poor women, and so on and so forth. So some of these things are very direct. And many of his, he's also, I think, a great enthusiast for technology in the sense of outcomes. And he loves what technology can do without perhaps understanding the mechanics and the details of how exactly the technology works. The other thing, I mean, the two points I will make is that his foreign policy and increasingly his military policies are, in a sense, reflective of his aspirational tilt of his persona. He has traveled to America as a backpacker, has traveled through 29 states in America, being hosted by BJP and RSS support base in the United States, but by and large traveling. And I've lived in the States for 15 odd years, and I haven't traveled through 29 states. So this man has, and he loves America. It's kind of love that hasn't, that has, shall we say, overcome the humiliation he faced when Washington denied him the visa, for instance. That was no problem, because his overarching love for America is in the aspirational sense, in the material sense of a country that is so good, so clean, so technologically driven, so wealthy, all the sort of things that he'd like to see India also become in time. This leads me to the last point, that his over-tilt to the United States in foreign military policies. It is really a bad thing to have happened for the very simple reason that it is happening at a time where there is deglobalization, first of all, of security and economics and everything else. India, unfortunately, has had, has always been bad in terms of catching the wave. We never catch it. We're almost at we are laggards, we're institutional laggards, and therefore never really benefit from any wave that comes along. In this case, the geoeconomics wave. That was there in the 90s. China caught it, it worked it, it's now a very superior power. We did not reform in time and so on, and it didn't work out for us. So that is one aspect. But why is his over-tilt to the US that policy inclination? It's supported by an ecosystem in Delhi that has emerged. And I find it has an insidious influence on policy. And by this I mean, straightforwardly, all the American think tanks, Carnegie, Brookings, and so on, that have set up chapters in Delhi, funded incidentally by Indian corporates. So we end up, in a sense, paying for the advice they proffer the government, which is not, that conforms to the US line on just about every policy issue. But there is something even worse that has happened. Most of for instance, this capital procurement, and it's not just in the defense field, in other fields, in all fields, the inducements that the US can offer that very few other supplier countries can. In the main, well, green cards, so-called ships to their progeny, work visas. You have a problem wherein I think I have Manishankar Iyer saying in the book that for instance, the Foreign Service, the Indian Foreign Service, he says almost 98% of the Indian Foreign Service is so compromised. Now, this is bad news. Of course, I have a very senior Foreign Service officer telling me, but that's because we all like the American values of freedom and so on and so forth that we can, in a sense, hew to and etc. But does that not, in many ways, influence your policy options or the advice you offer the Prime Minister when it's asked for it? So this is the kind of danger that we have. And it's as true of the military as anybody else. Military, by the way, is very much part of this ecosystem, the support system that the American overtilt has. So there are many other things that I'm sure Ajay will bring out, and then we can discuss. Oh, yes. One last thing. I've said that, what's the way forward? The way forward, I've said, is to try to separate the Pluto Hegemons. Who are the Pluto Hegemons in the world today? One is China, the other is the United States. US and China, in any group, end up dominating those groups, do they not? They do, by the sheer size and power, comprehensive power. And therefore, they are very difficult to deal with. For instance, BRICS. China dominates BRICS to an extent wherein, all the other countries, including Russia and India, are sidelined. Similarly, what's the Quadrilateral with Australia, Japan, the US, and India? US dominates it. They set down the parameters of policy. And willy-nilly, all the other states have to, pretty much take it or lump it. So the idea then is, what is a kind of a security coalition or a comprehensive coalition that will help India's cause, better help India's cause? And I have conceived, in a sense, in the book, a chapter is devoted to what I call BRICS, that's BRICS minus China, and the Quadrilateral is the same Japan, Australia, India, and the Southeast Asian countries, minus the United States. The United States can come in as and when it wants to, but it's very unlikely that it's ever going to take on China in any meaningful fashion, either in the military sense or any other sense, because of the economic interlinks. The Chinese can, as you all know, they hold over $1 trillion, 1.2 trillion at last count, in treasury bonds. They can bring down Wall Street in a day, or less in an hour, or perhaps in 5 minutes. So it's not something to be trifled with. And Washington, no matter whether it's Trump or anybody else, is not going to take on China. So if they're not going to take on China, and Asian states are left to their own devices to deal with China, then we have to think of our own solutions. And that's why I've conceived what I call the mod quad, modified quadrilateral, which is without the United States. They can come in when it wants. Is that good? Yeah. Very good.
We'll now request the Penguin representatives and to sort of help us, and Mr. Yashwant Sinha will release the book by formally unwrapping it before us. Thank you. Okay, so the book, before we start, may I request everybody to put their mobiles off or on silent? Bharat is a very hardline conservative person, and he's got his team outside, and any mobile phone that rings is likely to be destroyed in a controlled explosion. So there are many themes in the book, and he was able to touch upon just a very few of them. He's also one of the few strategists who's completely familiar with military tactics and strategy and operational art, familiar with weapons procurement, the defense economy. He writes on all these things in the book. And as all of us sitting at the table over here know, it's 400 pages of dense prose. So be prepared for a good read, a good long read. Many of the themes in your last book, which is called Why India is Not a Great Power, in brackets, yet, which came out, if I recall correctly, in 2015. Many of the themes fleshed out there have been taken forward in this book, sort of updated, sort of the events of the last 3 years incorporated into it. But just for the sake of anyone in the audience who might not know, your conservative views are sort of daunting. Bharat believes that India should not be wasting its time with Pakistan. Pakistan is small fry. It's a problem that can easily be solved. India should be focusing instead on the real challenge, which is from China. He believes that the partnership with the United States is constraining India. It binds India to a certain set of actions, which is not necessarily in India's interests. He believes that India should abandon the no first use nuclear doctrine and be prepared to go first with nuclear weapons.
Only against China.
Only against China, okay. Good news for the rest of the world.
And target the Three Gorges Dam.
And not just the Three Gorges Dam, but block Himalayan passes with atomic demolition munitions that will be detonated in case China dares to pass through and invade India. And to deter a Chinese response, naturally you would need thermonuclear weapons, properly tested, deployed, and readily available, which are, in Bharat's words, the final arbiters of power. And of course, India should be establishing military bases abroad in areas like Central Asia to outflank China and Pakistan. Now, Bharat, you plow a lonely furrow on many of these issues. There would be gasps of horror from many audiences in India, but that's not because of the ideas being bad. That's just because we are so locked into a liberal consensus that whichever government comes into power in India basically takes ownership of the same set of strategic ideas. If you notice, the Modi government's strategic performance is about the same as the last government's. On your blog, you style yourself India's foremost conservative strategist, but I think that should be India's only conservative strategist. So my question, and I'll address that to Mr. Yashwant Sinha, is there space in India for conservative strategy? Or are we just sort of, we have that same Nehruvian continued forward strategy, the same set of ideas, no first use, restraint, a sort of easy international image. Is there space for a hardline thinker like Bharat?
There certainly is a space, and that's why a person like Bharat exists. Otherwise, he would have been demolished by now, and effectively. He has expressed, as you've said, a number of very radical ideas in this book, and some of us may or may not agree with what he's saying and thinking. But as far as the space is concerned, I would grant it to him that there is a space for such thinking. There is space for such thinking influencing government policy from time to time. And these things, we need somebody to point out these things. Because as Bharat has said and as you've said, otherwise we just follow along the beaten path. And that's what, as he says, and I agree, governments have done from time to time. So we, as far as governments are concerned, I would say we need not go the whole hog that he recommends, but at least make some advance in that direction. He's saying, for instance, in this book that we have adopted, and I plead guilty because I was party to that decision, that there will be no first use. And if every nuclear power in the world were to say that there will be no first use on our part, then we'll live in a world where there is no nuclear threat. But Pakistan clearly is saying that they will use nuclear weapons against India. And from time to time, responsible officials in Pakistan do hold out those threats. And Bharat says in this book that Pakistan might use, in case of conflict, tactical nuclear weapons. And India may not, they hope, India may not get time to respond because the world powers will intervene in the meanwhile, those few minutes or seconds that we'll have. And that perhaps is true also vis-a-vis China. I mean, if China were to attack us with nuclear weapons, we'll perhaps not get time. So I personally feel, despite being a party to the no first use nuclear doctrine, that a time has come when India should seriously re-examine the nuclear doctrine, and by all means, why not take into account views that Bharat has expressed and views that other people have expressed, and then come to a decision. I mean, after all, it is 15 years since the nuclear doctrine was adopted by India, and a lot has happened in the world in these 15 years. So on that point, I'll agree. I may not agree with his suggestion that we should unleash nuclear weapons on the Three Gorges Dam in China or any other target, but I'll certainly agree that there is a case for re-examining the nuclear doctrine that we adopted in 2003.
Okay, so need to re-evaluate no first use. The news channels have already got their first news here. Bharat, to you, had you been in the US, for example, you would have been an illustrious company, the Heritage Foundation, plenty of conservative think tanks. Just tell us, what's it like being a conservative strategist here?
Well, I do feel lonely, for one. But I think there's a considered view about the utility of nuclear weapons, which we tend to sort of poo-poo, because we assume in an uninformed sort of way that nuclear weapons have no real, shall we say, no real use. They are therefore deterrents. Now, deterrence, how is deterrence, in a sense, strengthened? It is by preparing to use it. So the adversary, unless the adversary sees you as being prepared to use nuclear weapons, the deterrent value is lost. The Chinese and the Pakistanis, by the way, the Pakistanis for certain, because I think there was some nuclear signaling, I think Shankar perhaps is aware. I'm perhaps the only person who has had a briefing by Lieutenant General Asaf Ali of the SPD. And that was nuclear signaling. I think I was debriefed by the Special Branch Raw and so on after I came back. But the point, I think, is that they actually premise their tactical first use on the basis that India will not respond, that there will be time after they use tactical nuclear first in an isolated area within their territory and so on, for foreign powers to intervene and then to cajole and coerce Delhi, to which we usually succumb, to, try and sort of roll with it and not respond in kind. And I think one of the things that hurts our credibility is the massive retaliation. Because massive retaliation is ipso facto not credible, which is the point I made when we were in the drafting group. And that's why the draft doctrine was something very different from what ended up being gazetted in 2003.
Okay, moving on. We go on to what you were alluding to, Bharat. Modi's sizzle sort of turning into fizzle as you do it. He's very good at these sort of sizzle into fizzle type terms. He writes that Modi's promises leading into the 2014 election had really created a sizzle, an end to corruption, structural changes in the economic realm, focus on technology to provide development solutions, improve delivery of goods and services. These are things that appeal to the voter. But these promises, maximum governance, minimum government, and so on, have not come to pass. And that's what has turned the sizzle into fizzle. Jairam Ramesh, take off your Congress hat, put on your economist hat. Are things really that bad? Has the sizzle turned into fizzle? Because the business community is still enthusiastic, the Sensex is rising. There seems to be a high degree of optimism out there.
Well, Mr. Modi is certainly a self-made man, and he is in love with his creator, and that comes out in the book very, very clearly. I think I think Bharat's point in the book is that there were certain expectations that were generated in 2014, and you judge a leader by the expectations that he has generated and to the extent to which those expectations have been fulfilled. And judged by that criteria alone, I would say that the last 4 years have been a deep disappointment. They've been a deep disappointment in economic terms. It's been a deep disappointment even in foreign policy terms. I mean, I was present when he was being sworn in, and there was an electric atmosphere when the SAARC leaders, the prime ministers, all present at a swearing in. But it took a couple of months for that atmosphere to dissipate itself. So I'm not entirely sure that yes, there are headlines, there are there are people who come out and say that things are good. But if you really look at the real economy, and you just have to take yesterday's Reserve Bank report on demonetization and see what a complete farce demonetization proved to be. That 99.3% of the 15.4 lakh crores has actually come back into the Central Bank of India.
So
that
what's the market optimism? Just address that.
Well, the FDI flows are buoyant. Foreign direct investment is buoyant, and I find it extraordinary that Mr. Modi, who came to power deriding the concept of growth based on foreign direct investment, has now become the greatest champion of FDI. But there's an extraordinary spectacle. There's FDI, but there is no DI. There's no domestic investment. There's all foreign direct investment coming into e-commerce, coming into the digital world, not creating a lot of jobs, by the way, but certainly getting a lot of foreign exchange support and balance of payment supports. The markets are buoyant. Markets have their own logic. I'm not going to judge an economy by the way the markets are behaving, but I would judge an economy by what the real indicators are looking at. I think when you really look at the real indicators, not the headline indicators, but the real indicators, there is cause for deep concern. You look at electricity consumption, you look at rail freight movement, you look at bank credit. I mean, these are real indicators. I think on that basis, the promise that he joked in 2014 that the Indian rupee will soon approximate Dr. Manmohan Singh's age, and he's turning out, he's doing everything to make sure that the rupee becomes first Mr. Yashwant Sinha's age and then Dr. Manmohan Singh's age. I mean, here was a man who was extolling the fact that we should have 40 rupees to the dollar. and what is the reality, what is happening. Now, I'm not saying that that was the right position to take, but I'm just saying, what did he say and what has happened? Judge him by what he said and what has actually happened. And I think there's a tremendous slip between the lip and the cup when it comes to his performance.
Shiv Shankar Menon, Sizzle or Fizzle?
Well, in foreign policy, I think you're right that certainly our neighbors expected much more with that first, when they were invited to the swearing in. And unfortunately, I think Bharat calls it that we have strategically sort of shrunk in recent years. I mean, I differ with Bharat on many things. He thinks this has been going on since Mr. Nehru's time. In fact, he has a good word for Nehru throughout. He says that was when we ran a good policy. And ever since, it's been downhill, which I don't think is actually true. If you look at, we were the second greatest beneficiary of the globalization decades after China. And if you look at the record for the last 30 years, we kept the peace. The first 25 years of the Republic, we fought 4 wars, debilitating, paid the price for it, kept the peace, and did enough security to actually have the best years of the Republic. But I think I agree with him that recently, actually, we've shrunk. You look at our relationship with each of our neighbors. You look at our security. You look at what's happened in the Indian Ocean. Look at Maldives recently. This kind of thing didn't happen previously. And we shouldn't fool ourselves by thinking this is constant, this is normal, this is the new normal, as some people try and tell us. And I think that is because there is a fundamental lack of a vision of how we deal with it. And the book deals with this in some detail. Unless you have a sense of how you work in your neighborhood, how you pacify your neighborhood, how you... Bharat makes a good point that the only way you can get the subcontinent to be one geopolitical unit or a strategic unit again is actually by either accommodating or neutralizing Pakistan. And therefore, Pakistan policy, it's a strategic distraction because it actually ties you down and gives every other power in the world a way to interfere in your affairs and to manage your behavior. And I think Bharat is valid when he says that our main strategic focus should be China. Bharat makes one other point, which I think is also the reason for this fizzle rather than sizzle, which is this instinctive deference to power that this government seems to show, a sort of, whereas it's almost bullying to those it considers less powerful. And that has very bad effects on the neighborhood, especially where, as it is, the temptation is to create nationalism against the biggest power which is in their societies, which is India. And given that situation, the last thing you need to do is to stoke that. And unfortunately, that's exactly what's happened in the last few years. So there's a real problem here, where unless you have some vision of what kind of neighborhood you want, and unless you concentrate on what you're doing in South Asia. Now, Bharat deals primarily with the military, but also with the politics of it. He talks of new organizations, the Mod Quad or the BRIS without the Chinese in it. And this is the real value of a conservative thinker like Bharat. He can say things that governments can never say. They think, but they can't say. They might do, but again, they'll never profess, because this is not in the realms of public or practical diplomacy. But we need to think these thoughts, and we need to actually go through the arguments among ourselves, set ourselves our own goals, and do what we don't assume. And this is a word of caution also to Bharat. Please don't assume that what you don't see doesn't exist, especially on the nuclear side, because nothing in our doctrine prevents the kind of flexible response that Bharat is asking for. On no first use, I want to make one last point. Bharat says that the Pakistani threat of no first use is empty, that it means nothing. But then he tells us, go and do the same threat to the Chinese. Now, it's true. He has different uses for nuclear weapons in each case. And he can give us a 10-hour lecture, actually, on this. But to me, there is something that he needs to explain in a little more detail. Maybe when he does a revised edition with an index, then he can actually tell us how he thinks our first use against China would be credible when we should not take Pakistani first use threats seriously.
Bharat, you want to have the last word on this?
Not the last word, but a word. I think one of the problems of the Modi regime is that there is no national vision, as Shankar said. But there hasn't been, in a very long time, actually a national vision that is properly articulated and that is known to all the agencies of government, including all the line ministries. It's not known. So every ministry is virtually sovereign in defining the national interest. And so what happens is you have very diverse kind of policies, that are being implemented, which makes nonsense of coherence in policy. It's not there. Now, one of the things, when you say that Modi doesn't have a national vision, he hasn't articulated one, strategy, no plan, there's just the abstract notion of India as, if there is a vision, it is India as a Vishwa Guru. How do you implement it? I mean, assuming that we are a civilizational power, what does that mean? So my point is that, it reminds me of Alice in Wonderland, who discovered that if you don't know where you're going, any path will take you there.
Okay, let's move on. So much of criticism of the government, and we haven't even come to liberal and illiberal sort of subjects as yet. So let's talk about the paradox of what Bharat has called Modi's liberal internationalist foreign policy and the growingly illiberal Indian state. Admiral Arun Prakash, you know a thing or two about policy, the 2.5 front war threat versus the internal divisions and the fault lines within the Indian polity and the nation. Bharat's words, and I've got to quote this, he says Modi has nudged the fairly tolerant social order that has evolved over the millennia to accommodate an extraordinarily complex Indian society into a Hinduist straitjacket in line with the thinking of the RSS. Bharat doesn't say it, but the impression I get is that he sees this internal threat as the bigger threat than that so-called 2.5 front war. How do you see it?
Well, for about the last 7 decades, I think we've lived in a happy utopian kind of existence where we've never paid attention to these issues. We've taken everybody lived in more or less in harmony. And especially in the armed forces, this is a very touchy issue because on a ship or a submarine or an infantry battalion, as you know, everybody serves together. You go into battle together. You don't differentiate on the basis of anything, whether it's caste or religion or anything. You can't, because if you look with suspicion at your fellow comrade in arms, then your whole cohesion, military cohesion, will fall apart. So to the military, this comes as a very sort of traumatic kind of exposure that now we've started differentiating in terms of caste, in terms of religion, etc. So I think this is a very dangerous ground that we are treading on if this be true. I mean, this has not been articulated, but the signs that you see, I live in the smallest state of the country, in a small town, so I'm not a Lutyens type. And all my inputs come from, I've stopped watching TV a few months ago, but newspapers, I talk to my driver, gardener, etc. So the inputs come from those kind of sources. So this is, and going back to this fizzle and foozle, I think we may be jumping the gun by looking at metrics which are apparent to people in Delhi. I'm taking the contrarian view that it's the people on the ground, the farmer, the unorganized sector, the peanut vendor on the footpath, the small shopkeeper. He's the one who's going to decide whether it's a fizzle or a foozle. I think FDI figures or GDP figures, etc., don't mean much. But coming back to the issue that you've raised, I think we are treading on dangerous ground. That there is time to take a step back, think very carefully about it. And I'm speaking as a former armed forces person, that it goes against the grain of our national security to even think or speak or much less talk on those terms.
Okay, Bharat's book sums up in one succinct sentence the whole sort of aim of the book and the sort of theme. He says, this book is in the main a critique of Modi's foreign and national security policies, an audit, if you will. If readers find the analysis suffused with disappointment, they will not be wrong. Bharat, as a conservative strategist, one would imagine that you would have welcomed the arrival of Modi, a hardline policy, a sort of nationalist approach, and so on. Tell us how this expectation turned to disappointment.
That's a very long story, but I'll cut it short. Essentially, I think the India First ideology that I thought Modi represented, India First concept was actually conceived by me in my writings in 2001, 2002, and it was picked up by the BJP, the new dispensation. They did not keep to the metrics that I sort of articulated in my India First notions. They sort of departed from it in very substantive ways. Now, that's the time when I should have realized early on that it's not the same India First notions that I had. And the problem there is the India First, if you were to implement it, policies that rely on hard power, and see, the point about soft power is that it's most influential when it's backed by hard power. Soft power by itself means nothing. And that's the reason why most of the universal cultures in this day and age, like the United States, is, their influence is so great because their military is so big and so powerful. So this is the point that is, in a sense, distilled into armed self-sufficiency for me. If you are dependent on foreign suppliers for your armament, for your self-protection, you are never genuinely free. You're always going to be a dependency. And here there are historical kind of, to me, very striking similarities. And I'll very briefly mention it because it's very important, the arms self-sufficiency angle, which Modi, perhaps in a diffuse sort of way, sought to achieve with Make in India program, but that's gone nowhere. It's a stillborn program. It's achieved nothing. But the point, I think, is that historically, you have Vasco da Gama coming into Calicut in 1598? 1498, sorry. 1498. Some gunsmiths from his ship, jump ship in Calicut, Shankar is there, is his home ground. They jump ship and begin casting guns. And within a year, they have sold 400 guns to the Zamorin of Calicut. Now, the same Portuguese go to China, Canton. They touch down in Canton in 1521 and sell guns. Within 2 years, you have the Chinese metal workers reproducing the same artillery pieces. 62 or thereabouts, the same Portuguese then go to Japan, again sell guns. Within 20 years, they make guns, according to the Portuguese, that are as good, if not better, than what the European gunsmiths are making. So how is it that culture of buying is not recent, is the point I'm trying to make. We are still more Zamorin than we are, shall we say, as the Chinese were in those days. And on this score, Tipu Sultan Hyder Ali, his father, invented the battlefield rocket systems. Unique in the world. For the first time, there was a military innovation, technology innovation, that Indian kingdoms were responsible for. And they used it to devastating effect in the 4 Anglo-Carnatic wars. And you have very high company extolling the virtues of these Mysorean rockets, because that's the one thing the British didn't want to face. Entirely indigenous innovation and development. What did the English do after 1799 in the Battle of Seringamapatna? The first thing they tried to do was get a cache of these Mysorean rockets and send them to Woolwich Arsenal, where they were reverse engineered and the first Congreve rockets came out, right? And here our attitude is, and in the military, military people and service chiefs talking about why we shouldn't reverse engineer anything, that would be not responsible thing to do, and so on and so forth. This is the attitude. And the Chinese, they have reverse engineered everything. They have stolen if necessary. They have bought when they could. But otherwise become self-sufficient in no time at all. They set up the complex of reverse engineering armaments that they got from the Soviet Union. That complex had 6,000 engineers and draftsmen and technicians who were at it. Their first generation of hardware that they produced was crap. But the subsequent, they're now the leaders. We didn't even take the first step because our services, the leaders, simply didn't, first of all, trust the Indian talent, didn't want what they called inferior military hardware to fight with, etc. And I think this is the kind of short-term thinking, myopic thinking that's afflicted the country and its interests.
Let's give a disclaimer here that Admiral Arun Prakash is not covered by this because the Navy is the one service that has built its own weapons.
Yeah, and I wasn't around in Tipu Sultan's time anyway. But I think in this book, as well as in Bharat's last book, he's barking up the wrong tree. He's excoriated the service leadership of the military for, for hankering for foreign armaments and so on. But the real culprits are political masters, with apologies to those sitting on the stage. India free in 1947, China civil war finishes in 1949, and I understand that both countries were more or less on the same ground, same economy, etc. Within 10 years, the Chinese kick out the Russians and launch a national level program. The Chinese leadership, the statesmen, the politicians, a national campaign called Guo Chan Hua, which is reverse engineer every single item of Soviet armament, from AK-47s to MiG-19s to missiles to everything. In about 15 to 20 years, they manage some crude versions of Russian armament. Then they go into phase 2. Then they link up with the United States and start stealing, buying, whatever way,
hacking
their technology. And that's where we are today. In our case, no politician, no statesman has had the vision to think about the fact that being self-sufficient in military-industrial items is one of the keys to power. Economy is one, and self-sufficiency in military hardware is number 2.
That's absolutely wrong, Admiral. Absolutely.
I haven't finished.
100%.
May I just finish?
It's absolutely wrong.
May I finish? So Nehru, as Bharat repeatedly points out, went for the HF-24. He got a German designer, etc. We made 170. This was a superb aircraft. It had a great future. No one, military included, had the foresight or the vision to say, let's persevere, we'll make something out of it. We built an Aero engine, which I saw personally in 1976 in a DRDO laboratory. They said, this is a turbine GTTX. It will be ready in 5, 10, 15 years. It's now 40 years. It's nowhere in sight. At some point, the DRDO decided to close down the project. There was nobody, no politician, no defense minister ever said, hold on, let's get on with it. The Tejas is the same. So it's not the military. The military will do with whatever is given to it. They want the best. If it comes from abroad, so be it. But to blame the military is unfair. It is the defense, the prime minister, he's going to fight the war. And defense minister at his right hand. So they should have had the vision that, okay, we may not be in government after 5 years, but the nation has to go on. So let's launch a 20, 30, 40-year program. But the visions have been limited to 5 years of their term. Nobody has, even till today, nobody's given thought to producing anything.
Okay, Jairam, have your say.
Due respect to the Admiral, this completely goes against all historical evidence. Completely. And if you go back in time and see what Krishna Menon started in the defense ministry, and the roots of his problem with the defense establishment was his insistence on self-sufficiency. And, to say that no political leader, I mean, in 1962, There is an agreement that is signed with the Soviet Union, and the key condition in that agreement is that you should manufacture the MiG aircraft in India. The Make in India in 1962, April of 1962.
Yes.
What about now?
To say that politicians and political leaders have not had the vision and determination for self-sufficiency is absolutely 100% false.
Can I say something? I don't want to get between the politicians and the armed forces, and that's the most dangerous position to be in. No, but what I do want to say is, there is a larger picture here. If you look at strategic weapons, nuclear weapons, space, ballistic missiles, etc., we did them all ourselves. Nobody outside, nothing. And you can say we took a long time, we should have done it better, etc., but we did something which no other country actually managed the way we did. And we separated our peaceful programs from the military ones, and we did it. And we did it together, across these various silos, whether it was scientists, the armed forces, even the hated bureaucracy which Bharat curses, and the politicians gave consistently right through. So
Can I just put one thought
why is it
to
that
you?
only in conventional weapons, where frankly it only comes to the politicians for a decision right at the end of the process? We've devised a process which stymies us. And Bharat goes into this in great detail in the book about how this process is impossible. So I'm not getting into who's responsible. Everybody in this process is responsible. I refuse to say that one person is more or less, because if any one of them stymies this process in conventional weapons, the whole process stops. It just deadlocks. So really, I'm not into this
Okay,
now. Each one will fight his own corner. Go ahead and beat him up.
Just to
No,
sort
but
of.
I think you made a slightly wrong point. The process you're talking about is acquisition of arms, not manufacture, not establishment of a military industrial complex is a job of the.
No, but it's also on the defense production side. If you look at the LCA's history, and look at how we've treated the LCA. And frankly, I think everybody treated it badly, but with such a good aircraft that it survived the worst we could do to it. But anyway, let's not get into this argument.
Let's just put a little context into this, because this is an important point that we have been missing. I'll just draw to your attention the fact that we have succeeded in every project where import and foreign components were completely impossible, like space, like missile rocketry, like ballistic missiles. The minute you have given the leeway to import, whether it's in aerospace technology or whether it's in anything else, we have tended to abandon the path of self-sufficiency and go in for the foreign acquisition path, at least in components, in technologies, and so on. Mr. Sinha, how would you see this? How would you account for this? That when we have to do it, we can do it, but we don't want to really do it.
Well, I'll take the middle ground and avoid the internecine conflict in the government. You see, in many areas, we need foreign technology. Where foreign technology is not forbidden, is available, where we need foreign technology, right? Now, with foreign technology will come some foreign investment. What is our policy as far as defense production is concerned with regard to foreign investment and foreign technology? I remember very well that when I was finance minister, we took a baby step of permitting 26% foreign direct investment in defense production.
2001.
Yeah. And it was in the teeth of such terrible opposition from which quarters. And I had to call those people into my living room and explain to them in simple terms whether we would consider it better to import billions of dollars worth of equipment, or we'll have some foreign direct investment and start producing those things in India. And it was, I wouldn't say that I carried conviction, But, it was stop, go, stop, go. Now, this government has taken, I would say, a major step in permitting, majority stake in defense production. And I think that is what we need. Instead of getting into these quarrels, what we need is foreign direct investment with foreign technology in defense production. And by all means, allow our scientists and technicians to develop whatever they can develop indigenously. I mean, the cryogenic rockets were indigenous, as you said, in space. So when forced, we do achieve excellent results. But when we are not forced, we sit back, relax, and we are lazy.
We'll just come back at the end to this, Bharat. Okay, this is a very contentious subject. Let's move on to an even more contentious one. Bharat Karnad attempts to decode Modi's political psychology based on his actions right since the time he was an RSS sevak, emerging on the landscape of Gujarat and on to his move in Delhi. Professor Ashish Nandi, as many people would know, has already famously declared that Modi bears all the characteristics of a fascist. But Karnad, in his book, chooses between David Rosen's 6 psychological type models. These are narcissist or obsessive compulsive, Machiavellian, authoritarian, paranoid, and totalitarian. All very complimentary. And he concludes that Modi is a narcissist. Now, Rosen says narcissists are, and I quote, charismatic, attention-seeking, extremely convincing liars, and are the ultimate users of people. Demanding loyalty from others, they seldom give in return and don't always make the best decisions, but they generally make the best leaders. Mr. Yashwant Sinha, which of the 6 category types would you place Modi?
I'll find it very difficult to agree that he is a narcissist. And I'll point out that Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee came out of the same school, and he was none of these 6. So necessarily coming from that stock would be one of these 6 types is something which I don't buy. We are analyzing Modi as Prime Minister of India, but for some of us who have known him from before that, he was a very different kind of a person. And
What kind?
He was more amenable. I have gone, he took me once in Ahmedabad when he was not even Chief Minister of Gujarat to that little room in the Sangh headquarters where he lived. And that room was so small that apart from one cot and a small little table, there was nothing else that you could accommodate in that room. It was not 7 Racecourse Road. So that was the humble Modi. He was not any of these things which will fit this type. But having said that, I'd also like to point out from my experience of politics that, in our case, leaders become charismatic suddenly. Suddenly one day somebody is a charismatic leader. He was just a nobody before that. And I've seen this happen in many cases. Some of them are now in jail. Well, that's another matter. But they were great charismatic leaders. So Modi also has become charismatic because he is occupying the position of the Prime Minister of India. When he's not Prime Minister of India, then he'll not be charismatic. That's how people look at it, and that's how I look at it also.
No, I mean, I tend to avoid psychohistory in my biographies, and there's a lot of psychohistory in this biography. Well, it's not a biography, but it's a portrait of a leader who set out to change the nation. Which of the 6? Well, I would say all of the above, actually.
Mix of things.
Okay, just clarify.
No, basically, what I've tried to do is say that there's no pure phenotype. All political leaders are mix of these, have the mix of these traits. There is no pure narcissist, no pure authoritarian, no pure Machiavellian, and they can't be separated really. I mean, between Machiavellian and authoritarian, well, where's the difference? So the point I was trying to make, and I made, is that he's a mix, as are most politicians. And therefore, I have not dwelled too much on the psychological aspect, other than saying that if you see him and you want to assess his persona, maybe these are the kinds of traits that describe him. That's all. There's not a psychological profiling that perhaps, by the way, which most major intelligence agencies or major countries do when dealing with leaders of third world, especially countries whom they want to get a fix on, a psychological fix on. And certainly the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States does it all the time for most third world leaders, and they've done a very intensive job of Modi.
Ajay, would you permit me to ask a question of Bharat? He's put Modi in the league of the alpha males, half a dozen of them who have emerged in various countries. Now, would Bharat say that the conditions in those countries, as well as in India, were ripe for the emergence of an alpha male leader?
I suppose so. If you look at the situation, there are some commonalities that have thrown up such leaders. But the alpha male, I think, that entire characteristic can be distilled into the fact that they're so self-centered. Whatever happens in their countries is about them. And that's true of Erdogan in particular, because we have cultural affinities. And you see how his party has progressed in terms of defining the priorities, social priorities, and so on. That's true of Shinzo Abe, our fellow Asian state, and so on.
Bharat, I'd like to point out that both Erdogan and Putin have been around for a while.
Yes.
They have been around for a while. So have they suddenly become alpha males that they were not before?
No, they have. But look at how they have also sculpted and shaped the system. Erdogan has just got his referendum through. By a bare majority, it's true. But he has got a referendum through. He's now installed himself as a president who cannot be questioned. He has virtually, run the parliament out of the reckoning in Turkey. And Shinzo Abe, for instance, has virtually decimated the opposition, simply because these are people who have done structural restructuring of the entire organization of state. Abe has redone the peace constitution, the Article 9. Erdogan has installed the presidential system, and he's virtually unchallenged for the next 15 years. Mr. Putin has done the same, but these are, of course, authoritarian, totalitarian systems they inherited, which is what, if you think of Mr. Modi's move and his inclination for a presidential kind of system, one poll, one election, etc., you get an idea. Of course, he may not be able to achieve it. The fact is, these are the sorts of outcomes that Mr. Modi would hope to achieve if he were successful, which other people have. And look at one of the main, I think, shortfalls of Modi's regime. What's the one thing that would have gotten him an extended stay in power? It is the employment generation that he promised. He promised 5 crores every year, whatever it is, employed. You have jobless growth in India in the last 3 years. There has been growth, but it's jobless growth. You have, therefore, an accretion in the ranks of what I would call the lumpen, who then get channeled into the very activities of a religious nature. They have that under that aegis, wherein and so on. So this is the kind of danger you have. and by the way, all the others have restructured the government like Trump has. He has literally bulldozed the public bureaucracy in a very serious way, undermined them. It has just been questioned in the Supreme Court. I think the appellate court is taking Trump's initiative, executive order, that banned unionizing, and you can't mandatorily take fees from members and so on and so forth. Emmanuel Macron, who is a bacha type, you see, amongst these stalwarts, has in 1 year, by executive diktat, virtually defanged the public sector, which in France is so powerful, that has held the Fifth Republic onwards to ransom. He did it inside of a year. So the point I'm trying to make is, had he been so motivated, he had the parliamentary majority, he had the people behind him, he could have done some radical restructuring of the state.